The Grand Forester Creations runway show in Italy was meant to be a dazzling celebration of fashion and success. The evening had been meticulously planned, the gowns glittering under the stage lights, and the eyes of the international fashion world trained on the Forester brand. Ridge Forrester, always the face of the company, stood at the center of the event, his smile sharp as ever, proud of the work that had brought Forrester to the forefront of the fashion industry once again. But beneath the flawless surface, there was tension. The kind of tension that could tear families apart. Nick Marone, with his towering presence and undeniable intensity, had always been a thorn in Ridge's side. But tonight, he wasn't just an outsider. Tonight, he was ready to confront Ridge with something far more personal than business. Their rivalry had reached its boiling point long before this evening, but tonight, it was about something that neither of them could ignore. Brooke. Brooke, the woman they both loved, the woman they both thought would choose them over the other. But Brooke's indecisiveness had fractured both of their hearts, and now it was about to break something else entirely. Nick, having flown in for the show under the pretense of business, had no interest in simply being an observer. He had been waiting for this moment, watching Ridge in his element, watching Brooke by his side. He could barely stomach the sight of it. As the show began, Nick made his way backstage, where Ridge stood, surveying the event like the king he believed himself to be. Brooke was nearby, laughing with Steffi, completely unaware of the storm brewing. Nick's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. "So, how does it feel, Ridge? Watching your woman dancing between you and me." Ridge turned slowly, eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. "Not this again, Nick. You think you can come in here and create more chaos? You've always been this way. Just a man who can't stand to see anyone else succeed." Nick smirked. "It's not about success. It's about her." He stepped closer to Ridge, his voice lowering, filled with venom. "You don't even know what she really wants. She's stuck in your shadow, and you don't even see it. She needs someone who can love her without control, without holding her back." "Don't pretend you understand anything about love," Ridge shot back, his anger rising. "You've always had an agenda. You've been after Brooke for years, and I'm not going to let you manipulate her again." "Manipulate her?" Nick's voice rose. "You don't get it, do you? You don't get her. She's not a prize to be won, Ridge. She's a woman. A woman who deserves better than to be trapped in your endless cycle of lies and self-justification." Ridge's expression darkened, and in that moment, the confrontation hit its tipping point. Without warning, Nick swung his fist, connecting with Ridge's jaw in a brutal punch that sent him crashing into a nearby prop. Ridge stumbled backward, the force of the blow leaving him dazed, his vision blurring. "Nick, stop!" Brooke cried, rushing forward, but it was too late. Ridge was already on the ground, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His hand reached out to steady himself, but his legs gave way, and he collapsed in front of the stunned onlookers. Eric, who had been overseeing the show from the sidelines, rushed over, panic in his eyes. "What's happening here? What did you do, Nick?" Nick, breathing heavily, looked down at Ridge's unconscious form, his chest heaving with the remnants of his rage. He didn't answer. His gaze was cold, steely, filled with a mix of satisfaction and regret. He turned and began walking away, brushing past Brooke without so much as a glance. "You'll all see, in the end," he muttered under his breath, his steps quickening as he made his way toward the exit. Brooke knelt beside Ridge, her hands shaking as she checked his pulse. "Ridge, please, wake up." But there was no response. He was still and pale, blood staining his shirt. Eric's voice broke through the chaos. "Get a doctor now," he shouted, his face a mask of worry. Within moments, paramedics arrived on the scene. They rushed to stabilize Ridge, placing him on a stretcher and preparing to transport him to the nearest hospital. Brooke stayed by his side, her heart racing with fear, her mind spinning. What had just happened? How had everything unraveled so quickly? As Ridge was rushed to the hospital, Eric stood in stunned silence, unable to process what had just occurred. The reality of the situation was dawning on him. His son, the face of Forrester Creations, was gravely injured, and Nick Marone had just caused it all. There was no more pretending. No more business as usual. This was personal. In the hospital, the news was grim. Ridge was in critical condition. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but it was clear that the damage was severe. His injuries included a concussion, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding. But the worst was yet to come. As the doctors ran more tests, they found something unexpected, something that no one had anticipated. A mass. A tumor hidden deep within Ridge's body, possibly in his liver. It was a discovery that stunned the medical team, who quickly informed Eric and Brooke. "This changes everything," the doctor said gravely. "The tumor is large. We'll need to run more tests to determine if it's malignant. But this complicates things." Eric's face drained of color. His mind raced. Ridge's life was hanging by a thread, and now there was the added complication of a potentially deadly diagnosis. How could this happen? How could their family be facing this? Brooke's hands trembled as she clutched Ridge's cold hand, unable to hold back the tears. "Please, don't take him from me. Not like this. Not now." Eric placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, though his own fear mirrored hers. "We'll get through this. He's strong. He'll fight. We have to believe that." Meanwhile, Nick had gone into hiding, knowing that the consequences of his actions were too severe to face just yet. He had left the country without a word to anyone, avoiding all calls and messages from Brooke, Eric, and the authorities. But the guilt weighed heavily on him, as did the knowledge that he had just destroyed everything he'd wanted to prove. Ridge was now fighting for his life, and Nick was nowhere to be found. As the hours passed in the hospital, the Forrester family held their collective breath. Doctors continued to monitor Ridge's condition, but there was no clear answer. Would he survive the injuries from the beating? Would he pull through the operation necessary to remove the tumor? The odds seemed stacked against him, and yet the family remained hopeful, knowing Ridge's strength had always been his greatest asset. But the emotional toll was far from over. Hope, who had been beside Ridge every moment of the day, finally collapsed in the waiting room, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Her wedding, which had once been a symbol of hope and happiness, now seemed like a distant memory. She was no longer the bride. She was a woman fighting to hold on to the man she loved, her heart breaking at the thought of losing him. Hours turned into days as Ridge remained unconscious. The medical team worked tirelessly, but the tumor's size and the internal bleeding created complications at every turn. Eric and Brooke couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. They stayed by Ridge's side, unwilling to leave him for a second, hoping that somehow he would wake up and give them the reassurance they needed. But each passing moment only deepened their fear. In a quiet corner of the hospital, the doctors gathered to discuss the results of the latest tests. The tumor was confirmed to be malignant, a rare form of cancer that had spread aggressively. It was not a matter of if Ridge would recover, it was a matter of how much time he had left. Brooke's world shattered in that moment. She had always believed Ridge was invincible. They had been through so much together, and now here he was, lying in a hospital bed with a diagnosis that had no easy solution. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. She felt as though the world was collapsing around her. Eric, ever the patriarch, was the first to speak. "We'll fight this. We have to. For Ridge. For our family." But deep down, even Eric knew that the fight ahead would be unlike anything they had ever faced. Meanwhile, Nick remained in hiding, haunted by the aftermath of his actions. He knew that no apology could undo the harm he had caused. No amount of time could erase the memory of Ridge's bleeding body. But he also knew that the battle for Ridge's life had only just begun. And as the Forrester family gathered in the hospital, waiting for the final verdict on Ridge's survival, they couldn't help but wonder, would Ridge pull through? And would Nick ever face the consequences of the choices he had made? The atmosphere in the hospital was thick with anticipation and dread. The Forrester family huddled together, clinging to one another in the sterile waiting room. Brooke, her eyes red from crying, sat beside Eric, who was pacing, his face a mask of worry and frustration. Hope sat nearby, staring at the floor, her hands twisted in her lap. Thomas and Steffi, who had arrived just hours earlier, stood near the window, the weight of the situation sinking in. The surgery had begun hours ago. Ridge was in the operating room, under the care of one of the best neurosurgeons in the world. The hope was that the tumor, which had been discovered only days before, could be removed successfully. The doctors had told them the operation was risky. There were complications with the tumor's location, near critical brain functions. They were prepared for the worst, but they had promised to do everything they could. But even with the best care, even with all the prayers and hope in the room, the doctors couldn't prepare for what was coming next. The surgical team had initially been optimistic. They had managed to get through the most difficult parts of the procedure without complications. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. The tumor was deeper than expected, more entangled with brain tissue than the scans had shown. The risk of bleeding became higher as they made progress. And then, when the surgeon attempted to remove the final section of the tumor, Ridge's brain began to swell. The pressure on his skull increased dramatically. The medical team fought to stabilize him, but the complications escalated too quickly. Minutes felt like hours. Inside the operating room, the surgeon's hands moved with precision, but there was panic in the air now. Ridge's blood pressure plummeted. His vitals became unstable. The heart monitor's beeping grew more erratic, and the team scrambled to find a solution. A medic was at Ridge's side, administering fluids and pressing down on the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. But the tumor's location had made the procedure a ticking time bomb, and it became clear that Ridge's body couldn't handle the stress of the operation. Back in the waiting room, the family sat in torturous silence, waiting for any word. Eric had his hands clasped in prayer, his face pale and drawn, while Brooke held on to him, trying not to break down. Hope's eyes were fixed on the door, her breath shallow, praying that the doctors would emerge with good news. Steffi kept glancing at her phone, unable to sit still, while Thomas's gaze remained fixed on the floor, his heart heavy with worry. Finally, the door to the waiting room opened, and the surgeon stepped in, his face ashen. Brooke stood up immediately. "How is he? Is he okay?" The surgeon shook his head, his voice low. "I'm sorry, we did everything we could. Ridge didn't make it through the surgery." The room fell into stunned silence. Brooke's legs gave way, and she collapsed into Eric's arms. Hope staggered back, her chest tight, unable to breathe. Steffi stood frozen, her face pale with disbelief. Thomas closed his eyes, his entire body tense with the crushing weight of the news. He didn't survive?" Eric's voice cracked as he tried to process the words. The surgeon nodded, his face filled with sorrow. The tumor was deeper than expected. There were complications during the procedure. His brain swelled, and the pressure became too much. His heart stopped before we could stabilize him. "I'm so sorry." The words were like a punch to the gut. The man they had all depended on, the man who had built Forrester Creations, the man who had been the patriarch, the father, the husband, was gone. Brooke broke down completely, sobs racking her body as Eric held her tightly. Hope stood motionless, tears streaming down her face as the reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. Ridge was gone. Just like that. The man who had been the center of their lives, the man who had been the love of her mother's life, the man who had been her rock, was now gone. Thomas looked at his sister, his voice barely a whisper. He's gone, Steffi. He's really gone. Steffi, still in shock, shook her head, unable to accept the truth. No. No, this isn't happening. Not like this. Not Ridge. In the moments that followed, the family was plunged into a kind of numbness. The grief was overwhelming. Ridge had been their anchor, their leader. His death shattered their foundation, leaving them to struggle with an uncertain future. As the hospital staff prepared to move Ridge's body, Eric, Brooke, and the children were left to process the loss. There were no words of comfort. There was only silence. Nick Marone, who had been in hiding after the altercation with Ridge, learned of the tragic news hours later. His first reaction was one of disbelief, followed by a profound sense of guilt. He had been the one to strike the blow that had sent Ridge into the hospital in the first place. And now Ridge was dead. Nick's mind raced, filled with confusion and regret. Could his actions have indirectly caused this? If he had just walked away, would Ridge still be alive? At the same time, another dark reality was emerging. Ridge's death had triggered a devastating ripple effect. As the family grieved, they also had to face the truth about Ridge's health. The doctors had found something they hadn't expected, something no one knew about until it was too late. The tumor wasn't just affecting his brain, it was metastasizing from somewhere else. It had been growing undetected, slowly ravaging his body. The final scan showed signs of cancer, possibly spreading through other organs. In the midst of their grief, another diagnosis hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ridge's health had been deteriorating much longer than anyone had realized. His own body had betrayed him long before Nick's blow. The timing of the surgery had been a cruel coincidence. Ridge's death was not just from the physical trauma, it was the culmination of an undiagnosed illness that had been slowly taking him away from them. Eric, already broken by Ridge's death, now faced the painful reality of what had been hidden. His son had been living with a time bomb inside him, and no one knew. No one had the chance to prepare, to say goodbye, to say the things that mattered most. In the weeks that followed, as the Forrester family tried to heal from the shock, questions swirled about Ridge's final days. Had he known the truth about his health? Had he kept it from Brooke and the family to protect them from the pain? Did Ridge's death signal the end of an era for Forrester Creations? But the most haunting question lingered, unspoken among the mourners. Would they ever truly know if Nick's actions had accelerated Ridge's death? Had it been the confrontation that caused his body to give up? Or had the cancer already done the damage, long before Ridge had fallen into the operating room? The Forrester family was left to pick up the pieces, to honor Ridge's legacy while grappling with the reality of a future without him. Brooke, her heart shattered by the loss, found herself once again at a crossroads. She had lost the man who had been her partner, her confidant. Carter, who had stood by her side through the turmoil, now watched as she sank deeper into grief, knowing that their relationship could never escape the shadow of Ridge's death. For the Forresters, Ridge's passing was not just the loss of a father and husband, it was the loss of the very man who had shaped the legacy they now struggled to rebuild. The future of Forrester Creations was uncertain, and the question that hung in the air was this: could they survive without the man who had always led them through the storm? As the Forrester family mourned, the world around them seemed to move forward. But their hearts remained broken, and the questions surrounding Ridge's death would linger long after the funeral. Would the Forresters ever truly heal? Or would they remain haunted by the unanswered questions of Ridge's final days and the man who had inadvertently set it all in motion? The battle for the Forrester legacy was only just beginning.